How did people live in these cities? Were there social classes like rich and poor, powerful and weak? Something similar to the caste system that appeared later in India. And the biggest question, did these people also believe in gods and goddesses? So, in today's documentary, we're going to take you back about 5,000 years to the same land where humans first learned to build a civilization. And if you like interesting and deeply researched stories like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel, because making these documentaries takes us hours of hard work and research. A long time ago, when there were no cities, no laws, no religion, and no king's rule, humans were the most vulnerable creatures on this earth. They didn't have sharp teeth, claws, or any animal-like weapons. Strength, still, he survived because he had the ability to learn and understand. Early humans roamed the forests. They lived in caves, and their whole life revolved around just one question: will there be food today or not? Will we survive the night? Back then, humans were hunters and gatherers. They chased animals, collected wild fruits and roots, and moved around with the seasons. They didn't have a permanent home. No land belonged to them, and there was no plan for the future. Every day was a new battle, and every night brought new fears. But despite all that, humans didn't give up. They made tools out of stones, used wood and bones, and slowly developed hunting strategies. Then came the moment that set humans apart from other creatures: the discovery of fire. Fire wasn't just a source of heat or light. It was protection, power, and a sign of change. Fire made humans the rulers of the night. From cooking raw meat to keeping wild animals away, fire made life a bit safer. But even bigger than that was how, sitting around the fire, humans learned to talk, using gestures. The journey from language started right here. Gradually, humans began domesticating animals. First dogs, then sheep, music, goats, and cows. It wasn't just for convenience, but also a way to prepare for the future. Still, life wasn't stable because food was uncertain. There was no control over the rain, and with each season, they had to move to a new place. That's when a dangerous but revolutionary question popped into human minds. What if, instead of wandering around every time, we settle in one place? This question wasn't easy because settling down meant risk. If the crop failed, there was no backup plan. But this very risk pushed humans forward. They started experimenting with planting seeds. They learned about the soil, studied the weather, and slowly laid the foundation of farming. But farming didn't just appear overnight. It was the result of thousands of years of learning and failures. This is where the biggest change in human history begins: human migration. People moved out of Africa and spread across different parts of the world. Some groups reached the Indus Valley in India, which later became the Harappa civilization. Civilization developed. Some people reached as far as China's Yellow River, and some reached a land that changed the entire course of human civilization: the Tigris and Euphrates Valley. Now, here's a question. Why did almost every major civilization spring up by a river? Was it just a coincidence or a sign of human understanding? Actually, rivers back then were the biggest guarantee of life: water, fertile soil, fish, and routes for travel, all in one place. And the Tigris and Euphrates were the most powerful combination of all these. Along these rivers, when humans first arrived, they realized they could live sustainably by syncing with nature. The soil here became even more fertile after the floods. But life wasn't easy because floods could be both a blessing and a curse. And this is what humans did that truly made them human. They tried to understand and control nature. This is where humans shifted from being hunters to farmers, from wandering groups to settled communities, and from living in fear to planning for the future. It wasn't just a change in lifestyle. It was a shift in thinking. Because now, humans started thinking not just for today, but for the generations to come. And this mindset eventually laid the foundation for the world's first civilizations. And this is where we'll step into the next chapter. A place where rivers aren't just water sources, but the backbone of power and society. Where farming isn't just about food, but becomes the basis of politics, religion, and war. When humans decided to settle down, their biggest question wasn't where they would live, but who would you live with without support? Because a stable life meant steady water, and this need pulled humans towards rivers. But not every river could be the mother of civilization for humans. For that, you needed rivers that gave life but also posed challenges. That's exactly the role the Tigris and Euphrates played. Two rivers that, like a calm mother, provided food, but also, like an angry god, brought destruction. The Tigris and Euphrates weren't ordinary rivers. They came down from the mountains, had strong currents, and every year suddenly flooded, sometimes so fiercely that the village would flood, and sometimes it was so generous that the fields would shine like gold. Living by these rivers wasn't easy, but humans took the biggest risk here: music, because they understood that where there's great danger, there's also great opportunity. And that's where the experiment began: music that didn't just make humans hunters of nature, but its strategic partners. Every year, these rivers' floods brought new fertile soil, a kind of soil where, as soon as you plant seeds, life bursts forth. But this blessing music only became. There was a time when humans started to understand floods, and that was the turning point: music, when humans began not just to see nature, but to actually read it. They noticed the weather, understood water levels, and slowly music figured out when the river stayed calm and when it turned wild. That's where planning was born, the first sign of civilization: music. Now here's an important question. If floods were so dangerous: music, why didn't humans just leave the area, thinking it was a curse from the gods? The answer lies in their growing understanding. Humans realized that if music, that water, if you can turn it, stop it, and bring it to the fields, then this flood can become its biggest weapon. And this idea gave birth to the first irrigation system in human history. Canals were dug, earthen dams were built, and for the first time, water was forced to flow at the command of humans. This was no small feat because digging canals required collective labor. It needed planning and leadership. And from here, the first glimpse of power within society appears. Now, no single person could make decisions alone. It had to be decided who would. The canal will be built first. Which field gets how much water, and if there's a dispute, who'll decide? This is where administration, rules, and eventually governance begin. As control over rivers increased, so did human confidence. Waves of barley and wheat started appearing in the fields. Date palms became a steady food source, and for the first time, people felt sure there'd be food tomorrow. But here's the catch. When the future feels secure, does a person become calmer or more greedy? Because history shows that along with security comes competition. Settlements began to pop up along the rivers. Small villages started to form: music, and gradually the distance between these villages decreased. People began trading, sharing resources, and that's when conflicts started too. Water was no longer just about survival, it became power. Whoever controlled the canals held the real music power, and that's why the civilization along the Tigris and Euphrates wasn't just agricultural but political as well. Later, Greek travelers named this land Mesopotamia, which music means between two rivers. Land between rivers. But this name doesn't just describe geography. It also reflects a mindset where people were trying to find a balance between two forces: nature and control, freedom and order, fear and ambition. Over time, this area became more than just a collection of villages. It turned into a cultural hub we now call the Fertile Crescent. It's where ideas like farming, cities, writing, and laws first spread to other parts of the world. But that brings up another question. If this land was so fertile, then why did every civilization? Why couldn't it last here? Because fertile land music brings prosperity quickly, but it also sparks conflict just as fast. Rivers gave humans something else too: a way to travel. People started using boats' music to move goods and ideas from one place to another. And that's how Mesopotamia music became not just a local power, but a regional one. But as people grew more dependent on these rivers' music, their vulnerabilities became tied to them as well. Because if a river changed its course, entire lives were upended. And that's the most important turning point in this chapter: rivers. It wasn't just the birthplace of civilization. It was also shaping the future of music. Because the day humans fooled themselves into thinking they had total control over the rivers, they also unknowingly laid the foundation for their biggest mistake: music. But they only realized this truth when it was way too late. If you're still listening, you've probably understood by now that Mesopotamia wasn't just a music civilization settled between two rivers. It was the story of the first major deal struck between humans and nature. a deal that made humans civilized. But at the same time, it made him realize for the first time that the bigger the power, music, the heavier its price. If you're still with me, that means this story is really holding your attention. So please like the video to show your support so more research-based documentaries like this can keep coming. When humans started living by the rivers, they didn't just change their location. They changed their whole way of life. Because now, food didn't depend on luck or hunting, but music on land and hard work. That was the moment we now call the agricultural revolution. But it wasn't a change that happened overnight. It was the result of thousands of years of efforts, failures, and experiments. It was then that humans first realized that if they could understand even a little of nature's laws, they could shape their own future. The soil of Mesopotamia was incredibly fertile. But that alone wasn't enough because fertile soil turns barren without water. And the biggest problem with the Tigris and Euphrates rivers was that their water was sometimes too much. There used to be too much water or sometimes none at all. It was either flooding or drought. And this was the toughest challenge humans faced. Should they accept this uncertainty or try to control it? And humans did what makes them human. They took a risk. They started by digging small canals, diverting water towards the fields. This wasn't a one-person job. The whole community had to come together, and that's how collective labor began. Now, it became necessary to decide who would work and when. Who gets how much water, and if there's a fight, who decides? That's where rules, order, and power came from, because irrigation wasn't just a technique, it was about control. Gradually, people realized farming gave them not just food, but also time. They didn't have to chase after prey every day anymore. Now, they could plant seeds and wait, and that waiting gave them time to think. They started planning for the future. They began storing crops, built granaries, and for the first time, humans had a surplus, extra food. People started producing more than they needed. But this raises a question about retention. When someone has more than they need, do they share it or hold on to it? The extra grain changed society. Not everyone remained a farmer. Some became priests, some soldiers, some craftsmen, and some administrators. This is where society began to split into different classes. The success in farming also brought inequality. Those who controlled the land and water became powerful, while those who only had their labor stayed at the bottom. And over time, this difference became permanent. In Mesopotamia, the main crops were barley and wheat because they could survive both dry and wet conditions. Date palms became a lifeline since they provided food, sweet juice, alcohol, wood, and shade. Many tablets mention the expansion of date gardens, showing that these weren't just farms but strategic resources. This is where farming became not just a way of life but also a matter of politics. Along with farming, animal husbandry also developed. Bulls pulled plows. Cows and sheep gave milk. Goats and pigs were sources of meat. Camels and donkeys were used for long. Grains and goods started being carried over long distances. So farming and animal husbandry became complements to each other. And this was the system that kept cities alive. But this system had a weakness. It was completely dependent on rivers. With repeated irrigation, salt slowly began to build up in the soil. At first, no one paid attention because the crops were still growing. But over time, the yield started to drop. Fields turned barren, and instead of barley, only wheat crops grew. And this was a huge historical mistake. Humans created a problem. Instead of trying to understand, they just pressed down hard on the land, and this mistake ended up costing the entire civilization dearly. Farming wasn't just a technical job, it was also religious. Before planting any crop, people prayed to the gods. Deities like Enlil and Enki were seen as protectors of the fields. People believed that if the gods got angry, the whole crop could be destroyed. That's why agricultural festivals, sacrifices, and rituals were a regular part of life. And here's an interesting similarity. Just like in India today, where farmers celebrate festivals before and after the harvest. Just think about it. When cities started growing and the population increased, the pressure on farming must have shot up. Every year, more grain was needed, more water was needed, and more labor was required. That's when farmers stopped being just food providers and started carrying the weight of the whole system. Taxes went up. It became mandatory to give grain to temples and kings. And farming, which was once a path to freedom, slowly turned into a necessity they couldn't escape. And here's the biggest takeaway from this chapter. Mesopotamia taught humans that if technology and control aren't balanced, then power can turn into destruction. Irrigation gave birth to civilization, but that same irrigation slowly weakened its foundation. If you're still listening, you now get that farming isn't just about fields. It's a story about power, society, and the future. In the next chapter, we'll see how this agricultural surplus transformed villages into cities, how urban life was born for the first time, and how humans began to see themselves as above nature. Once farming provided a steady food supply, the next question naturally arose. So, how do we handle this growing population? Because as the grain production in the fields increased, the number of people started rising too. Small villages had now grown so big that no one really knew each other anymore. And this is where a new chapter in human history began, the chapter of villages turning into cities. But becoming a city wasn't just about having more houses. It was a whole story about changing ideas, power, and society. Life in the village was simple. People depended on each other. Decisions were made together, and most folks did pretty much the same kind of work. But as the population grew, this system started to break down. It became necessary to decide whose farm would be where, who gets water first, where the grain would be stored, and if someone broke the rules, who would punish them. And that's when the need for administration first arose. Because without control, a crowd is just a crowd, not a society. Gradually, some places developed where grain began to be stored, trade started happening, and religious activities became centralized. These places were different from villages. People there didn't just farm, they also planned. They kept track of things and gave orders. And that's how the city was born, a place that was not just somewhere to live, but the center of power. The biggest example of this change in Mesopotamia was Uruk. About 5,000 years ago, Uruk wasn't just a simple settlement, it became the world's first real city. Thousands of people lived there. There were tall ziggurat temples, wide streets, and walls all around. But those walls weren't just for protection. They were also a mental boundary, showing that a person living inside the city. Music, it was different, maybe even better. Life in the city had completely changed. People were no longer just farmers. Some were craftsmen, some traders, some soldiers, and some priests. The amount of work had increased, and this division was both the city's strength and its weakness. Because as work grew, people became more and more dependent on each other. And to control this dependency, rules and laws became necessary. This raises an important question. When a person gives up freedom in exchange for security, do they really become safe, or are they just controlled? Because the person living in the city now. Inside the walls, people felt safe, but they were also trapped by rules, taxes, and orders. Another big part of city life was religion. In villages, worship was personal, but in cities, religion became an institution. Ziggurats weren't just places to pray, they were symbols of power. The taller the temple, the bigger the god, and the stronger the authority. People believed gods lived above and humans lived below. This idea trickled down through every level of society. For the first time, cities needed a standing army, not just to protect lives, but also the grain stores, temples, and more. There was power. Walls were built, weapons were kept, and soldiers were trained. And from there, war stopped being just about defense and became a way to expand. City-states started clashing with each other for water, land, and trade routes. As the cities got richer, the gap between villages and cities grew. Villages produced grain, and the cities controlled it. Farmers worked hard, and the cities collected taxes. And that's where the divide between the common people and those in power began, a gap that still exists in some form even today. They existed. After Uruk, cities like Lagash, and Nippur emerged. Each city had its own god, its own king, and its own rules. But one thing was the same everywhere. Power was at the top, and the common people were at the bottom. And as the cities grew bigger, this gap only got wider. Now, here's something really important to understand. Cities aren't just the peak of civilization, they're also its test. Because resources in a city are limited, but desires are endless. And this imbalance slowly gives rise to tension, crime, and rebellion. We see many signs of this in the tablets of history. People started coming together when they were fed up with forced labor, taxes, and inequality. And here's the biggest takeaway from this chapter. Cities taught people that a crowd without order is dangerous. but too much order can suffocate a person. The cities of Mesopotamia kept trying to find that balance. If you're still with me, you've probably realized that building a city wasn't just about progress. It was a compromise. Freedom in exchange for security, equality in exchange for order. And in the next chapter, we'll see how laws, writing, and the administration started to completely control human life. This was the beginning of humanity's first journey, where a wandering hunter slowly became a farmer, where rivers became not just water but the flow of life and power, and where writing, laws, and order tied people together into the first societies. But the story doesn't end here, because within this system, kings, empires, wars, fear of gods, and the real game of power were born. Without understanding this, the story of Mesopotamia remains incomplete. In the next part, we'll see how these great kings who rose from these very cities turned laws into power, and how a civilization began to buckle under the weight of its own decisions. If you want to keep watching such deep, research-based documentaries, don't stop this journey here. Because history isn't just a story of the past, it's also a warning for today and the future. If you like documentaries that go beyond the story and dive deep into history, make sure to like this video and show your support. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on the story of humanity's beginnings. Music, let's not stop this journey through civilizations here. Make sure to tell us in the comments which part of Mesopotamia's story you found the most interesting. Music, because your opinion decides where the next documentary will go. For the next episode, write part 2 in the comments, where we'll see how the great kings who rose from these cities turned laws into power, and how a civilization began to buckle under the weight of its own decisions.
Whatever that they have to